Welcome back to Sissy Maya. Make sure to subscribe to our channel to never miss an update. Additionally, consider subscribing to my Patreon to get access to these features, and much more.
Emily stumbled into the office, her laptop in one hand and a case containing an LCD projector and a bulging purse, which doubled as her briefcase, slipping off her shoulder. "I need a cart," she muttered as her purse and projector crashed into an office chair by the door, and she collapsed into the other. Definitely need a cart. Days like these made her long for just a bit of her old energy. Well, maybe not that, but a few extra muscles would have helped. The phone on her desk blinked at her. Voicemail messages. Flash. Flash. A student missing class. Flash. Flash. A rescheduled meeting. Flash. Flash. Another teacher asking to borrow the projector or laptop. The messages were the same every day, just the names changed. The blinking light was practically screaming for her attention. While Emily appreciated technology, this constant electronic nagging got under her skin. She missed the handwritten messages on pink slips from Rosa at the switchboard. Sure, voicemail was more efficient, but it felt so impersonal. As she started retrieving the messages, a knock came at the door. She hung up the phone. "Come in." It was Maria from either the 9 o'clock or 1 o'clock class. Emily couldn't remember, but Maria needed help with her PowerPoint presentation. Emily couldn't help but chuckle inside again. Students were so intimidated by the tech aspect of the course, they came to her for help they should have sought from the start. The messages could wait. The student could not. By the time Maria left, it was a little after 5. Emily was tired but content. The student had come in with barely an idea and left with a near-complete presentation. Looking at the equipment piled in the corner, Emily muttered, "The back pain almost feels worth it," then added, "but a cart would still be nice." She stood up to leave but paused, noticing the blinking LED again. She could easily ignore it and deal with it tomorrow morning. But with a sigh, she sank back into her chair and pressed the button. She entered her passcode, 7494, the date of her surgery easy for her to remember, hard for anyone else to guess. You have 1 unplayed message. 2 saved messages. Press P to play. She didn't need to hear the rest. She hit P and listened. "Ms. Martin. Ms. Emily Martin. This is Robert Quavers from the Christina Show. I used to live in Reedley. I even went to Kings River College. Anyway, we're doing a show about transgenders in education, and it would be great to have someone from my hometown. My brother and sister took your class right after your change. Christina is like the Spanish Oprah and would be very sensitive. My number is 305-555-2459. Emily was a little shocked. She had always known that a phone call like this might come, but it was still surprising to hear it from the biggest Spanish-language talk show. The offer came completely out of nowhere. She had thought about this moment before, imagined how she might respond, but now that it was real, she found herself unsure. Should she do it? She decided to call Robert the next day and learn more. The shrill sound of her alarm clock dragged Emily from sleep. Okay, I'm getting up," she grumbled as she fumbled around her nightstand, eyes still closed. Once she yawned, stretched, and started waking up, she remembered why she'd set the alarm an hour early. She had to make a phone call. The receptionist answered in Spanish. Emily understood enough to know it was something like, "The Christina Show. Who do you want to talk to?" "Hi, Robert Quavers called me yesterday about being on your show. My name is Emily Martin," Emily said, feeling a little embarrassed that she didn't speak in Spanish, even though she could handle something simple. It reminded her of how many of her students probably felt about their own language skills. "Hey, glad you called back. Good to hear from someone from Reedley. How's everything over there?" After a few minutes of small talk about the town, the college, the weather, and the school teams, Robert finally got to the point. "Last week, my executive producer handed me an article about Dana Rivers, and we came up with this idea: everybody has a right to a private life. We thought it would be great to focus on transgenders in education, And of course, I thought of you. You made your change right on the job. How did that go? Pretty much without any major issues, Emily said. I don't have any dramatic stories to share. The Lord was good to me. I didn't face any serious challenges at work. My family was supportive. I have more friends now than I did before, and I even found a great church. The line was quiet for a moment. Emily couldn't tell if Robert was processing the information or if he was surprised that someone had a smooth transition. Maybe he had heard rumors on campus, whispered criticisms. No, she decided not to go there. Whether he had heard anything didn't matter, because she hadn't experienced those things, and she wasn't about to claim ownership of something she hadn't faced. The conversation lasted about an hour. Emily shared a lot of personal details and background information. She asked about the show and what the segment would be like. It seemed like the issue would be addressed thoughtfully, without sensationalism. So, here's the plan. We'll fly you to Miami on the 23rd, record the show on the 24th, and you can fly back on Saturday. Will you do the show? Robert asked. Emily had a vague recollection of having something planned for that weekend but couldn't quite remember what. Actually, I need to think about this carefully. I should talk to the college and my family, as it could impact them. And I need to decide if I want to be that public. Please, take your time. But think about the good you could do. We have a big audience, and people really need to understand this. Plus, you deserve your 15 minutes of fame. Emily smiled at that. Each week, around 5,000 people read something she wrote. In fact, according to her website stats, there wasn't an hour during the day when someone wasn't reading her material. She had her 15 minutes of fame every day. For someone who prided herself on her privacy, she had become quite a public figure in the transgender community. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. It wasn't something she planned, but it had happened, and it did bring her some satisfaction. Still, she wondered what had happened to the girl who just wanted to transition, teach at the college, attend church, and live a normal life without ever using the word transgender. Now, national TV? Was this just the next step in her journey, or was it crossing a boundary she wasn't ready to cross unless there was a significant purpose behind it other than boosting her own ego? Clearly, this was something that would require a lot of thought and prayer. Her conversations with both her parents and the college president yielded neutral, cautious support for whatever decision she made. It was frustrating. Why couldn't they be firmly against it or strongly in favor? The uncertainty didn't make the decision any easier. Emily posted to the Christian transgender mailing list she'd started 2 years ago. The responses were mixed, some in favor, others firmly opposed. Then there were the people who simply promised to pray for her, and those were the ones she appreciated the most. As Emily drove to church on Wednesday night, the thoughts about the show faded for a while. The pastor was out of town, and she'd be teaching his class. She might as well, since she'd written the material. She prayed for guidance on what to say and asked God to remind her to listen as well. Does your church have a lot of transgenders? Robert had asked. Actually, I'm the only one I know of, Emily replied. There was stunned silence on the other end of the line. Emily smiled as he stumbled over his words. You mean you go to a, excuse me for asking, normal church? Well, I wouldn't exactly call it normal. We're Pentecostal. Not sure any Pentecostal church fits the definition of normal. But yes, it's a regular church with regular people, and one transgender person. Emily had mixed feelings about churches that focused on specific groups. She understood the need for churches in Spanish-speaking or Hong communities, where language barriers were an issue. But churches were becoming more segmented, one for black people on one corner, a church for the homeless on another, and even a church with services scheduled around football games for the 49er faithful. A year ago, she was approached to start a cyber church for the transgender community. It would have made it easier for people struggling to find a church that felt like home, but she declined. She wasn't sure church was supposed to be easy, and being in an online community where everyone was like you didn't offer much room for growth. Of course, growth could be painful. Tonight, Emily was going to teach the pastor's Wednesday Bible study. 9 years ago, some people had wanted to kick her out of the church. Until 5 years ago, she had been banned from the women's meetings. Emily smiled as she thought about the invitation lying on the passenger seat beside her. It was from Tanya, the women's ministry director at church, inviting her to the annual sleepover. The personal touch was clear, and it felt sincere. Yet, just a few years ago, Tanya had been one of the ones who lobbied to exclude Emily from the women's group. Times change. People change. Growth happens. Patience pays off. Bible study that evening had a small turnout. Some people skipped out with the pastor out of town, but those who showed up were the backbone of the church. These were the ones you could count on to be there and serve. Emily still didn't feel comfortable asking for prayer about gender-related issues in a public group. She doubted she ever would. But she did request prayer in a more general way for an important decision she had to make by the end of the week. As she drove home, Emily began to pray about the show. Father, you said if we lack wisdom, we should ask of you. Well, I'm asking. I know this could be a great opportunity for ministry, maybe even a role model for some of my Latina sisters. It's not like I'm hiding, but many of my students watch that show, and some of them may not know about me yet. Do I choose personal comfort over a chance to do something good? I really need direction here. She kept driving and praying, the road and her thoughts blending together. Then, a flash of light from a street lamp illuminated the invitation on the seat next to her. Suddenly, she remembered the 24th was the date of the sleepover. That was what she'd forgotten. It was a small thing, really a night with friends, tacos, Bible trivia, and conversations that lasted into the night. The word transgender would never come up. It was simple, normal life. Emily's life today. Despite her involvement with the gender community, she realized she no longer felt part of it. Her life was here, with the simple pleasures of friendship, church, work, and yes, sleepovers. In her heart, she heard that familiar, still small voice of God. On the 24th, where do you belong? That was the question. Did she belong in a Miami studio, on display as a transgender college professor for millions of viewers, grabbing her 15 minutes of fame? Or did she belong with other daughters of God, enjoying the fellowship she'd fought so hard to find? When she put it that way, the answer became clear. She had long passed the point of being a transgender teacher or anything labeled with transgender. Now, she was just Emily, a simple Christian woman who belonged at her church's women's group on the 24th. With a deep sigh, Emily turned the car toward home and made a note to call Robert in the morning. She wouldn't be able to make the show after all. She had a prior commitment. As Emily walked through the door, she took in the sight of the messy room. About like my life, she thought, dropping her purse onto the coffee table, cluttered with speech evaluation sheets, research materials, books, and the big red Rembrandt family Bible placed right in the middle. She moved some papers off the Bible before collapsing onto the couch, feeling the weight of emotion build up inside her. This was going to be a rough one, she thought. Before she could break down, though, she needed to make a call. She dialed a familiar number in San Francisco and waited for the voicemail to finish. Luana, it's Emily Main, she said, pausing to collect herself. I think we should meet this Saturday. The hard times that all those good times led up to have arrived. Call me. After hanging up the phone, Emily let the tears flow. Being judged by strangers was tough, but being judged by those she knew and loved was devastating. The day had started off well. Sundays were special, up early, dressed, and out the door to church. At church, she sat next to an older lady who always made a point of asking Emily to sit near her. The regular teacher was absent, but the pastor did his best with the lesson. He wasn't a Bible teacher, though, and Emily missed teaching Bible studies herself. She hoped that someday she'd get the chance, after being at the church a bit longer. That hope seemed foolish now, Emily thought bitterly, as she reviewed the events of the day. After church, she moved around the room, chatting with everyone. She had discovered a new side of herself as a woman, something she never had as a man, the ability to be sociable. It was a part of herself that was blooming. A few children gathered around Emily. "Hi, Emily," one of them said. "I made this in children's church." A small green construction paper book was clutched tightly in a little hand. Emily gently took it and opened it, finding a pressed flower on one page, a twig on another, and some leaves on others, with the words "God made everything good" on the cover. She smiled, complimented the young creator, and handed the book back just as the mother arrived, full of apologies. "Don't worry," Emily reassured her. "Jackie and I were just talking about children's church." Emily did enjoy talking to children, though it always carried a touch of sadness, knowing she could never have children of her own. But the kids at First Church were as warm and friendly as their parents, and they often sought her out along with some of the teens, which surprised her at 38. If there was any age group that had trouble passing, it was teens. Later that afternoon, Emily bought a gift for the upcoming baby shower, which would take place after the women's meeting on Monday night. She had come to really enjoy these gatherings. The women's group was a place for meaningful, woman-to-woman conversation, and she looked forward to it. Initially, she had been nervous, but it was clear that everyone in the group accepted her. At least, that's what Emily thought, she muttered as she tossed the baby gift across the room. The evening service was uplifting, good music, good spirit, and afterward, Emily chatted with one of the ladies from the women's group. "You coming tomorrow night?" Nadine asked. "Of course. Wouldn't miss it," Emily replied. "We sure like having you," Nadine said, and Emily appreciated the sentiment. It made her feel like she truly belonged. A few months ago, things had been difficult due to a confrontation with Brother Parsons, who had returned to witness to Emily. She had told him she was saved and filled with the Spirit, thinking that would satisfy him. She told herself he was just an old man preaching to everyone, and that he hadn't read her. She wasn't convincing, but decided she wouldn't run unless it became necessary. In the meantime, Emily had become very attached to the people of the church. They had accepted her, referring to her with feminine pronouns, and she had even become friends with the wives of the pastor and associate pastor. As she talked to Nadine, the pastor arrived. He greeted them and then said, "Emily, I'd like to see you in my office after you finish here." Nadine quickly added, "It's okay, I was just boring her with some old lady talk." "You're not an old lady, and I'm not bored," Emily responded with a smile as she stood up, her legs shaky. She had a good idea of what this meeting would be about. The pastor's office was simple but comfortable. He was a Southern Pentecostal preacher who had been transplanted to California. He was fond of preaching about hell and often struggled with the English language, but Emily thought he was a good man and a caring pastor, even if not always the best preacher. His office reflected this: a scattering of books, an Afghan draped over the back of his chair, and 2 chairs in front of a well-worn wooden desk. The youth pastor joined them, sitting next to Emily with the pastor behind the desk. As Emily sat there, she couldn't help but think of the other confrontations she'd faced in church. At one church, she'd attended only a few weeks when a woman asked if they could sit together. Emily assumed it was a get-to-know-you initiative for the women's ministry, but after the service, the woman and a friend pulled Emily aside to criticize her. Afterward, the pastor told her he didn't want her returning to the church. Another time, at a different church, a woman stopped her in the parking lot and asked, "Are you male or female?" Emily, a Christian, didn't want to lie, so she replied, "I'm in transition." The woman then lectured her on how allowing people like me could hurt the health of the church. Emily chose to quietly fade away. Coming to First Church felt almost like coming home. The people were friendly and welcoming, and she had fit in seamlessly, despite the more emotional style of worship, which she hadn't been used to. But everything seemed right until this moment in the pastor's office. Emily knew enough to stay silent and let the pastor lead the conversation. He began calmly, "People often get nervous when they come to the pastor's office. I should have worn a longer skirt so he wouldn't see my knees knocking," Emily thought to herself. "But I'm really not a bad person. I don't bite," the pastor continued. "Emily, I think you've found First Church to be a welcoming place, and I think maybe you've found a home here. I believe the Lord has something for you here, and we want to help you find it. And nothing we say here means we want you to leave. Emily braced herself for the but. But, the pastor continued, you will need to follow 2 guidelines. First, don't use the ladies' restroom. No problem there, Emily thought. She hadn't used it anyway. She wasn't even sure where it was. And second, the women's meetings are for women. Some of the ladies might feel uncomfortable if you're there. The second guideline hit Emily like a punch to the gut. She felt a wave of emotion crash inside, but she managed to keep her face composed, forcing a small, submissive smile to hide the tremor in her lip. Emily nodded quietly. All right, I agree. The pastor continued, I want you to know, you don't have to leave. Some people on the board wanted me to ask you to, but I defended you. It's a trick of the enemy. We can't help you if you're not here, but these guidelines will help avoid some issues. Taking a deep breath, Emily replied, I don't want to cause problems. If my staying here is a problem, then I'll. Don't finish that sentence, the pastor interrupted firmly. I don't want to see you leave. Emily gathered what little courage she had left and said, let me tell you this, her voice steady but quiet, as the song says, I've come too far to turn back now. I won't turn my back on Christ, my salvation, or the church. I'll keep going, even if I have to find a better place next time. The youth pastor, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Emily, the pastor doesn't want you to leave. He defended you, and neither Pastor Randy nor I want you to go. The pastor added, and since we're the leaders here, you don't have to leave. Emily's shoulders relaxed slightly, but she still felt uneasy. I just don't want to cause any trouble. This is one of those areas that isn't covered in scripture. I'm not gay. To her surprise, the pastor didn't argue. No, I don't believe you are, he said thoughtfully. This really falls under working out your own salvation. We're not here to debate theology right now. But one thing I want to say, I don't want to offend my brothers and sisters. If my being here is a stumbling block, I will leave. I don't believe this is a sin, but being an offense, that would be. No, we love you, Emily, and we want you to stay, the pastor said. The theology discussion can wait for another time. Just follow the guidelines, and the Lord has something for you here. The 3 of them gathered in a circle and prayed together. The pastors, confused yet wanting to help, and Emily, a transgender woman, unsure of what this meant for her future. As they prayed, all 3 were soon praying in the Spirit, not paying much attention to the words. As Emily sat there, feeling discouraged and small, the weight of the decisions ahead pressed in on her. Should she trust them and stay at the church, knowing there were people talking about her? Knowing the pastors probably thought she was doing something wrong, though they didn't question her salvation, which was a small comfort, and that they might try to reform her. If they could pray the prayer of faith to cure her, Emily thought, then praise God. But deep down, Emily couldn't help but believe that God had made her a transgender woman for a reason. Over the past 6 months, she had seen growth in areas she hadn't expected: patience with anger, compassion for others, and a caring heart. Could she have learned these as a man? Maybe, but she hadn't. And when she thought about that prayer, she felt a peace settling in her heart. Sitting on the couch later, Emily closed her eyes and prayed quietly, Lord, you made me this way. I don't understand why, but I trust that you have a reason. Now I need wisdom. What should I do? Do I stay here, or do I find another church? If I leave, how do I explain it to everyone who only knows Emily as a woman? But if I stay, knowing that the pastors, the board, and maybe their wives know about my male side, how do I continue? And Lord, I need comfort too. I need to know it will be all right. There's pain here, deep pain. I need your healing touch. Give me something to hold on to. Emily knew God sometimes spoke audibly, but her experiences with his voice had usually been softer, quieter, yet still just as real. This time, though, she clearly heard the words, though she could never recall exactly how they sounded: stand still and see the glory of the Lord. As the words faded, Strength and even joy began to fill her. Wiping away her tears, Emily whispered, "All right, Lord, I guess it's time to stop running. But the pain will take time to heal." In her heart, she felt God's final words to her. "I never said it wouldn't, but remember, my wounds still bleed for you." Part 2, Victory. Emily folded the letter, having read it for the third time. A single tear slid down her cheek, cutting through the carefully applied makeup. It reminded her of the other tears she'd shed just 2 weeks ago, when she felt the carefully constructed world she'd built start to fall apart. A bittersweet smile crossed her face as she reflected on the complexity of her life. Joy and sorrow, pain and pleasure, love and hate, gain and loss, these opposing forces had shaped her transition from male to female, making it both a challenge and a journey of growth. The events of the past 2 weeks etched themselves into Emily's memory like a strange, comic nightmare, both laughable and terrifying. That Sunday morning, no words were exchanged, yet pain doesn't always need a verbal trigger. Emily had arrived early, greeted by the warm smile of the adult Bible class teacher. She knew he was aware of her background. The board had discussed her situation after an older gentleman requested her removal from the church. Instead of granting that request, the pastor and board had only asked her not to use the women's restroom or attend women's ministry meetings. The latter had stung, but Emily had accepted it. That was 4 months ago, and since then, nothing more had been said. Her friendships with some of the church ladies had blossomed, and it was clear that the discussion had stayed within the board. 2 older women in the church, who had sort of adopted Emily as their own, waved for her to join them. They sat right behind the older man who had complained about her. Emily, almost by chance, sat directly behind him and his wife. As the service began, fresh tears welled up in her eyes as the man turned around, saw Emily, whispered to his wife, and got up to leave. At the back of the auditorium, the Sunday school teacher stopped them. They talked, looked at Emily, pointed at her, and finally acquiesced, finding seats on the opposite side of the church. It didn't take a genius to figure out what had happened. The pain cut deep. Emily's first instinct was to grab her Bible and leave, but her pride held her in place. She stayed seated through the Sunday school lesson, fighting to keep her composure. She even tried to convince herself, using her debating skills, that they couldn't possibly be talking about her. There had to be another explanation. She just couldn't find one. Nature and despair soon played their parts. By the end of the lesson, Emily was desperate to go to the bathroom. The tension had built, and she couldn't hold it any longer. She slipped out quietly during the break, hoping no one noticed. Her home was just a mile away, and she could drive back quickly. The question was, did she want to return? Being read by strangers on a street corner, in a store, or at the mall is tough, especially when someone shouts a cruel name or laughs mockingly. It hurts. Transgender people who deny it are often lying about other things, too. But it's worse when you're read by people you know, people who matter, those who know you. That pain becomes personal, deep, and lasting. For a Christian transgender, the church is almost as sacred as family, and when faith and disdain collide in the form of righteous hatred, the hurt is magnified. This was the pain that cut through Emily's heart like a jagged blade. She felt like disappearing, walking away and never looking back. But she couldn't leave without one last look, one final chance to see and talk to the people she had come to love. She had just enough pride to not let him know how much he had hurt her. And, besides, there was still a small chance it wasn't about her at all. So, Emily dried her eyes, reapplied a little makeup to cover the smeared mascara, grabbed her purse and car keys, and headed back to the church. The back door creaked as Emily opened it, and it felt like every head in the room turned toward her as she walked in. But, on reflection, Emily realized it was only the people sitting in the last 2 pews who noticed. She sat in the back pew near the door, just in case. Well, she'd rather not think about that. The service felt different this time. It might be her last at this church. The choir sang several of her favorite hymns, and the pastor preached on the sin of discouraging others. Emily found the sermon title especially fitting. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered as the sermon began. After the service, Emily was talking to an older lady she had befriended when the Sunday school teacher approached. "I'm glad you came back, Emily," he said softly. "I hope you weren't hurt by what happened in class." Emily briefly closed her eyes. That confirmed it. Her presence, and their prejudice, had caused a couple to leave the service. Emily wanted to shout, "No, of course I wasn't hurt. Transgenders have hearts made of rubber and ice water in their veins. Nothing ever hurts us." But she couldn't bring herself to lash out at the man, knowing how embarrassed he already was. Instead, she quietly replied, "No, of course not. I just had to check something at home. My sanity," she added silently. For a moment, Emily sat still, overwhelmed by silent torment. She saw no way forward in the church. The situation had been framed as a him or her issue, and she couldn't force that kind of confrontation. She wasn't a hero, nor a warrior for any cause. She just wanted to blend in, to be accepted as another woman in the church. And if that wasn't possible, she just wanted to be left alone. Slowly, Emily rose, forced a smile onto her face, and began greeting people. Behind the facade of her smile, a well of tears was building. She knew this could be her last chance to speak with the people she had come to love, but she had to keep it casual, bright, as though nothing had happened. In the parking lot, she sat in her car for 5 minutes, gathering herself so she could drive safely. She fought back the tears all the way home. Once inside, she broke down completely, the tears flowing freely. Emily looked at the letter she was about to mail and remembered the 3 letters she had written that Sunday afternoon. The first was to the pastor, thanking him for his courtesy and informing him that she felt she should leave to avoid further trouble. The second, in a less formal tone, was addressed to the Sunday school teacher, thanking him for his kindness and teaching, but explaining that she could not stay in a place where there was so much conflict. The third letter was an apology to the man who had walked away from her. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't make the apology sound sincere. Finally, she gave up. "Lord, forgive me," she prayed. "It will take some time before I can love that man. Right now, I'm going to have to work on not letting bitterness take root." With the last letter written, Emily cried again. She thanked God for her tears. For 12 years as a man, she hadn't been able to cry. She had rediscovered tears through an old, sad movie. She wasn't sure how she could have survived the past few months without the release of her tears. Lying on the couch, she sobbed quietly until exhaustion took over, and she fell asleep. The following week was a blur for Emily. She taught her classes mechanically, ate without tasting the food, and slept in short, restless bursts. She woke up repeatedly, unable to get back to sleep, reading until it was almost time for school. Wednesday night, Bible study night, was especially hard. Emily had made many friends in this informal service, and staying home was not an option. To cope, she called a friend on the East Coast. She'd met this woman through an online gender forum, and their friendship had blossomed into regular phone calls. "Hi, this is Emily. Can we talk? You don't sound so good. Is everything all right?" "Not really. I'm sort of down." "Listen, hun, talk to me." So, Emily talked. For 2.5 hours, she poured out everything she had been holding inside. The problems hadn't gone away, but someone had listened. Someone cared. Emily smiled as she remembered that conversation. She was an only child, and this woman had become the closest thing to a sister she had. A sadness passed through her as she realized that this was the kind of thing she would have called her mother about. But her parents still didn't know about Emily, and that was something for the future. On Friday, the letter arrived. It was from the Sunday school teacher, signed by the pastoral staff. "Emily," it read, "we do not want you to leave First Church. We believe it would be difficult for you to find another church that will accept you while holding you accountable to the Word of God. While we do not condone your mode of dress, as it is contrary to Scripture, it is your right to attend worship services, and we will defend that right. If someone causes you grief or pain, that is their problem. God demands that we love unconditionally. We definitely want you to stay. The tears Emily thought were all used up on Sunday came rushing back as she read the letter. Here were people who didn't understand her life, didn't condone it, but loved her enough to encourage her to stay. But how could she stay? Was she supposed to push another person out of the church so she could remain? Could she bear to put the pastor and the board in the middle of potential conflict? Yet, would she let one person take away the friendships and fellowship she had worked so hard to build? Despite it all, Emily felt she had to leave. The counseling session on Saturday marked the first time Emily truly broke down, confronting the pain of the situation. "Why should you leave?" Luana asked. "I guess more than anything else," Emily answered. "I'm afraid if I stay, the gossip will spread. If I leave now, people will just say, 'Remember that nice lady, Emily, who used to come here?' But if I stay, they'll end up saying, 'Remember that interesting freak?'" The word freak hit Luana like a jolt. Her eyes darkened, and her breathing became controlled, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. Emily only remembered this later. At her last words, Emily began to cry uncontrollably, feeling foolish for forgetting to bring tissues. But Luana was ready, gently patting Emily's arm and offering a box of tissues. "I'll find another church," Emily said, as the tears started to subside. "But I'll go in late and leave early. That way, I won't risk being read. And if I am, it won't matter because I won't be attached to anyone there." "That's really sad," Luana said softly. "Especially since you just came out of your shell. I wouldn't want you to build it up again." "Well, shells are useful," Emily replied with a wry smile. "They protect you from getting hurt. At least until I can tell anyone who challenges me, 'Strip search me if you wish.' Until then, I'll just slowly vanish." With a final, quiet chuckle, Luana said, "I don't know. I think Emily's pretty irrepressible." As Emily shakily descended the steep steps from Luana's home office, she didn't feel irrepressible at all. But she had to pull herself together. She was meeting with a transgender person for coffee. She knew they would have questions and concerns, and Emily had to maintain the image of a strong woman who could face any challenge. On Sunday, Emily attended 2 church services at 2 different locations. The experience was the same. People shook hands when the pastor told them to, then ignored each other and the visitors the rest of the time. Mediocre music, uninspiring sermons. Emily was reminded that you don't realize what you have until it's gone. That afternoon, more tears followed. Before the first service, Emily dropped off a letter for the Sunday school teacher at First Church. The letter explained why she felt she must leave but also clarified what it meant to be transgender. She addressed scriptural objections, pointing out that gender dysphoria wasn't covered in the Bible and emphasized that it wasn't about transvestitism. She also mentioned that she was celibate. In a final, bitter concession, the last line read, "I'm sure that you, the board, the pastoral staff, and others will breathe a deep sigh of relief when I've gone." She sealed the envelope with tears. On Wednesday, Emily decided to drop by Bible study. She arrived late and sat at the back, where her problem wasn't present. She planned to slip out without speaking to anyone. But luck wasn't on her side. As the final Amen was said, she turned toward the door and nearly bumped into the Sunday school teacher. "Emily," he said, "I'm glad you came. I'll be sending you a letter soon. I just need a couple more signatures, but we really want you to stay." Emily fought back her tears and said, "Thank you, but please, just wait until you get the letter." "Sure," Emily said, managing a weak smile. As he left, Emily began her escape, walking briskly toward the door. But then she was stopped. "Hold on, I've got to shake you up." It was Sister Becky, the associate pastor's wife. Emily had become friendly with her before. It was one of those little jokes about shaking someone up, a gesture Emily found herself missing, even though the joke was silly. Shaking Emily's hand vigorously, Sister Becky said softly, "Please, don't go. We all love you." That did it. Emily almost ran out of the church, racing the tears to her car. Now, sitting in her car, Holding the letter in her hands, tears poured down her face, mixing with streaks of mascara. The letter was signed by the Sunday school teacher, the pastor, the youth pastor, the associate pastor, and each member of the church board. It read, "Emily, I hardly know where to begin. I've read and reread your letter many times, each time feeling deeply moved. Thank you for taking such a risk to help me understand your situation better. I felt a warm sense of gratitude, knowing you felt comfortable enough to share so openly and vulnerably. Please accept my apology if anything in my previous letter caused offense. If I did, it was due to a lack of understanding on my part. I wept as I read your letter, and I glimpsed the pain and injustices you suffer, how cruel and unchristian they are. Why should you leave?" Luana asked. "I guess more than anything else," Emily replied. "I'm afraid that if I stay, the gossip will spread. If I leave now, they'll just say, 'Remember that nice lady, Emily, who used to come here?' But if I stay, they'll be saying, 'Remember that interesting freak?'" At the word freak, Luana stiffened. Her eyes darkened, and her breathing became steady, showing her controlled anger. Emily didn't notice this at the time, but later it stood out in her memory. As she spoke those words, Emily began to cry uncontrollably, feeling foolish for not bringing any tissues. But Luana, ever prepared, gently patted her arm and handed her a box of tissues. "I'll find another church," Emily said as the tears began to subside. "But I'll go late and leave early. That way, I won't risk being read. And if I am, it won't matter because I won't be attached to anyone there." "That's really sad," Luana replied quietly. "Especially after you've just come out of your shell. I wouldn't want you to build it back up." "Well, shells are useful," Emily said with a wry smile. "They keep you from getting hurt. At least until I can say to anyone who challenges me, 'Strip search me if you wish.' Until then, I'll just slowly fade away." With a final chuckle, Luana said, "I don't know. I think Emily's pretty irrepressible." As Emily shakily made her way down the steep steps from Luana's office, she didn't feel irrepressible at all. She needed to pull herself together. She was meeting a maybe transgender for coffee. She knew they would have questions and concerns. Emily had to maintain the strong woman persona, someone who could handle whatever came her way. Sunday arrived with 2 church services at 2 different locations. The same routine, people shaking hands when the pastor prompted them, but otherwise ignoring each other and the visitors. Mediocre music, lackluster sermons. Emily couldn't help but feel the weight of it all, realizing how much she missed what had once been. More tears followed that afternoon. Before her first church service, Emily dropped off a letter with the Sunday school teacher at First Church. It explained why she felt she must leave, while also explaining what it meant to be transgender. She addressed scriptural objections, pointing out that gender dysphoria wasn't covered in the Bible and clarified that it wasn't about transvestitism. She also mentioned that she was celibate. In a moment of bitterness, the last line read, "I'm sure that you, the board, the pastoral staff, and others will breathe a sigh of relief when I leave." She sealed the envelope with tears. On Wednesday, Emily decided to attend Bible study. She arrived late and sat at the back, where her problem wasn't present. She planned to slip out without speaking to anyone. But, as usual, that didn't go as planned. After the final amen, she turned toward the door, only to nearly bump into the Sunday school teacher. "Emily," he said, "I'm glad you came. I'll be sending you a letter soon. I just need a couple more signatures. But we really want you to stay with us." Emily fought to hold back the tears and said, "Thank you, but please, just wait until you get the letter." "Sure," Emily said, managing a weak smile. As he walked away, Emily began her retreat, heading briskly for the door, only to be stopped. "Hold on, I've got to shake you up." It was Sister Becky, the associate pastor's wife. Emily had grown fond of her little joke about shaking someone's hand, and in that moment, she missed it more than she realized. Shaking Emily's hand firmly, Sister Becky said softly, "Please, don't go. We all love you." That was it. Emily practically ran out of the church, racing the tears to her car. Now, sitting in her car, holding the letter, the tears flowed again, streaking her mascara. The letter was signed by the Sunday school teacher, the pastor, the youth pastor, the associate pastor, and every member of the church board. It read, "Emily, I hardly know where to begin. I've read and reread your letter many times, each time feeling deeply moved. Thank you for taking such a risk to help me understand your situation better. I felt a warm sense of gratitude knowing you felt comfortable enough to share so openly and vulnerably. Please accept my apology if anything in my previous letter caused offense. If I did, it was due to a lack of understanding on my part. I wept as I read your letter, and I glimpsed the pain and injustices you suffer, how cruel and unchristian they are. Carl, she murmured as she stared at the picture. How did we get ourselves into this mess, and how are we going to get out of it?" Gazing at the image, like an artifact from a forgotten era, the flood of memories and pain surged into Emily's heart. The taunts from high school students, the disastrous dates with women, the constant posturing, and finally, the emotional walls she'd built around herself, walls made from her work, her teaching, her studies. The process of withdrawing and abandoning hope for meaningful relationships had torn her apart, sinking her into a year of depression. Slowly, the wounds healed, but they left scars, both blocking out pain and shutting away joy. Life became safer, but emptier, more stable, but colder, stronger, yet lonelier. The trade-offs had been harsh, but when hope dies, despair must be softened. Emily carefully slid the picture back into the drawer. The past was no longer her guide to the future. Unlike other women in their 40s, Emily never had puppy love, a prom date, or significant relationships with men. She had no fond memories of high school, college, or young adult dating experiences to rely on. She wasn't prepared for this. She had only been living as a woman for less than 5 years, and 5 years wasn't nearly enough time to develop the kind of feminine intuition that most women gain over a lifetime. In fact, in terms of relationships, she was less experienced than many high school girls. She never thought it would happen. The women's magazines talked about a man shortage, something about demographics, divorce rates, and economics. Emily never fully understood it, but she accepted the numbers on faith. Besides, at 40-something, the options narrow for both men and women. At 6 feet 1 inch in heels, Emily assumed that would further limit her prospects. Then she met Fred Parker, who stood at 6 feet 2 inches. Emily opened her purse and flipped open her wallet to the photo compartment. There was Fred, smiling widely, his grey eyes sparkling with mischief, the wind tousling his dark hair. He wasn't exactly movie star handsome, but his face reflected the ruggedness that came with his 45 years. The phone rang again, and Emily let it ring, allowing the machine to pick it up. "It's about 5:30, honey. I hope you get home soon. Please call. It's very important." It might not be the question, Emily thought. Maybe he just needs help with punctuation. That's how it all started, she remembered. Emily had handled PR for the church, using her marketing skills to pull off a few successful promotions in local papers. Fred worked for Roberts & Sons Clothiers, who needed help with a 100th anniversary promotion. The church secretary suggested he reach out to Emily. That night, Emily found a message on her machine. "I sent Fred Parker to you. Be nice to him. He's divorced, successful, with a 14-year-old son and a 12-year-old daughter. Don't let this one get away." Emily put together a simple promotion involving vintage carriages, automobiles, and clothing, arranged some media coverage, and gave Fred advice on advertising. He was impressed and took her to dinner as a thank you. From there, their relationship began to shift, with their focus turning more towards each other than the projects at hand. Emily had never had a steady date, even when she was Carl. She remembered that, as a man, she had always wanted a girlfriend not for a relationship, but for the social benefits. But she couldn't bring herself to use someone like that. After beginning her real-life test, Emily felt awkward about starting any romantic relationship, fearing both discovery and embarrassment for herself and her date. So, she watched others pair off while she remained there and Emily at the end of couples guest lists. She told herself it didn't bother her until her first real date. It wasn't Fred, but a man named Larry. He was part of the church's singles group, divorced like most everyone else, and asked her out for lunch. The lunch itself was fine, but Emily was so nervous she couldn't even remember what she ordered. They didn't fit well together and returned to their roles as polite fellow church members. That date stirred a longing Emily thought she had long buried. She remembered the last time she dated as a man, asking a woman named Meg Morgan out to dinner. The conversation had been pleasant, but Meg sensed that their relationship could only go so far. That night, Carl had gone home, cried for a few minutes, and cursed the prison of being caught between genders. He made a decision then. He could no longer fake it. If people thought he was gay, so be it. He couldn't continue the act and couldn't bear the pain any longer. At 28, he stopped dating after his 6th failed attempt in a decade. It was a door Emily thought had been closed and locked forever, but Larry, what's his name, had opened it again for her. The date was another failure, but it had given her hope for a normal social life. Fred and she seemed to fit together well. Not that they were always alike or agreed on everything, but where they differed, they brought something that the other was missing. It felt comfortable being with him. Having someone to sit next to in church, someone to bring to faculty parties, someone to talk to after grading 32 midterms, someone to hold her when she felt small and hurt. Having Fred by her side was the best thing that had happened in her life. She wasn't sure she could bear losing that. She wanted things to stay as they were. She cried because deep down, she knew that after tonight, things would never be the same. "What kind of answer can I give you?" she asked the picture. "Can I tell you the truth? Say, sure, Fred, I'd love to marry you. How about a June wedding? But after the honeymoon, what then? You'll find my bookplates with the name Carl Martin. You'll ask about my childhood. Or you'll find my MA papers under my former name. I can't keep that a secret forever."